On the 25th of January 1947, in a mansion in Miami, battered by a storm that seemed endless, the most feared man in the United States took his final breath. Waves crashed violently against the coast, trees fell as if nature itself wanted to witness the ending, and in the shadows, Al Capone, the Chicago mob boss, closed his eyes forever. His death went almost unnoticed. In the newspapers, the news was buried behind baseball results, as if no one remembered that this man had once held an entire nation in his hands. The coffin traveled by train from Florida to Chicago. Few relatives, a handful of loyal friends, and no funeral spectacle. Reporters were kept away, no cameras, no headlines. A simply handful of sand brought from Italy fell upon his grave, as tradition dictates. Then each attendee returned to everyday life, almost forgetting that the body belonged to the gangster who had once defied the government of the United States. But Capone was no ordinary criminal. His name was etched into history as a symbol of power, violence, and boundless ambition. And behind his downfall stood a man willing to risk everything, Eliot Ness. The 6th of October 1931. The Federal Court of Chicago opens its doors to one of the most anticipated trials in American criminal history. Al Capone, the man who had turned violence and smuggling into an empire, appears before the jury. The scene could be from a movie. Crowds of onlookers fill the streets. Journalists from across the country wait with their cameras, and flashes illuminate every gesture of America's most famous gangster. Capone appears serious, elegant but deep down, cornered. That day, he was not tried for murder, extortion, or even the St. Valentine's Day massacre. The charge that put him before the judges seemed almost absurd compared to his record: tax evasion, $75 million in undeclared income, the product of illegal alcohol, prostitution, and organized crime. The man who brought him there was neither a politician nor an ordinary policeman. He was Eliot Ness, the young Treasury agent who had sworn to bring down Chicago's untouchable boss. From the start, they saw each other as irreconcilable enemies. Capone pleaded not guilty and accused Ness of harassment, but the battle had only just begun. The first day of the trial ended shrouded in unbearable tension. The following day, the court delved into the life of the Italian-American, born in Brooklyn in 1899, who, rising from the margins of society, had become the absolute ruler of Chicago. That night, Capone avoided the company of his wife, May. In an armored car, he drove to one of his luxurious clubs. Music, alcohol, and a retinue of young, elegant women awaited him, women he maintained with dresses, jewelry, and money. They all admired him, they all depended on him. But that night, the sparkle in the boss's eyes had vanished. He knew that the next day he would be gambling not only his fortune, but also his freedom. The 7th of October 1931. The second day of the trial began with Capone arriving at the courthouse beneath a cloud of photographers. His unmistakable white hat immediately drew the attention of both the press and the public. Every gesture, every glance, was analyzed as if it were a national spectacle. The 8th of October 1931. The third day of the trial opened a window into his past. The prosecution recalled the origins of the Capone family. Neapolitan immigrants who arrived in New York in 1893, seeking a better future in the Italian neighborhood of Brooklyn. His father, Gabriele, a barber by trade, obtained U.S. citizenship in 1906. He was a hard-working man, the very image of the immigrant striving to succeed. But one of his 9 children chose a different path. Alphonse, the fourth in the family, soon showed a violent temper. At 14, he was expelled from school for assaulting a teacher. From then on, the streets became his true school, a place where he learned to earn respect through fear. Youth gangs ruled New York's neighborhoods. Irish, Sicilian, Jewish, and other immigrant groups fought for control of every corner. In that world, Capone learned that the law of the streets was written in blood. The Neapolitans preferred razors, the Irish, bricks. Between those two worlds, Al carved his path with brutality. He soon joined the feared 5 Points gang, cradle of future mobsters. There, among knives, gambling, and extortion, he became a gangster. Years later, a judge would sum up his fate with a chilling line. At just 17, you had already given your life to crime. During that day in court, an unexpected name surfaced: Vincenzo, Al's older brother. He had disappeared in adolescence, dreaming of joining Buffalo Bill's traveling show. He left to escape the violence consuming the family and never returned. Capone never spoke of him publicly, though he likely felt relief at not having to hear the moral lectures of that upright, distant brother. The 8th of October 1931. The trial continued. Capone's lawyers went on the offensive, insisting that their client was merely a scapegoat and that what was really being judged was not a man, but Prohibition itself. The audience reacted with murmurs of indignation. In 1919, the United States had passed the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture and sale of alcohol, a measure driven by moral reform leagues that sought to cleanse the nation of vice, but which ended up becoming the perfect breeding ground for the greatest expansion of organized crime in history. Capone was one of those who knew how to seize the opportunity. In his early days, he worked as a bouncer and enforcer in a dance club in Coney Island. By then, he was already married to May Coughlin, a young Irish woman from a rival family, with whom he would have his only son. He was young, but his reputation was terrifying. A cold, efficient, and ruthless killer. With him, every deal was carried out to the letter. That dark talent caught the attention of a man who would change his destiny forever. Johnny Torrio, his godfather and mentor, regarded as the true mastermind of the Chicago Mafia. It was Torrio who opened the doors of a city in full criminal bloom. Chicago was then described as the whore of America: casinos, cabarets, bought-off policemen, and corrupt politicians. Everything was for sale, and the money from illegal liquor tainted it all. Under Torrio's mentorship, Capone rose without restraint through the ranks of organized crime. He was jovial, elegant, and refined, capable of charming both in a ballroom and in a politician's office. But beneath that polished surface lay a darkness impossible to hide. The scar running across his face, barely masked with makeup, was a reminder of his true nature, that of a relentless and bloodthirsty gangster. The press gave him a nickname he despised, one no one dared utter in his presence: Scarface. By 1928, Al Capone was at his peak. He ruled Chicago with absolute power, convinced that nothing and no one could stop him. Meanwhile, his lawyers persisted in portraying him as a respectable businessman, a benefactor who had merely taken advantage of the opportunities of the time. The 9th of October 1931. In the courtroom, the 4th day of the trial was framed as a direct duel: good versus evil, Eliot Ness versus Al Capone. Silence filled the courtroom when the leader of the Untouchables was called to the stand. Name: Eliot Ness. He was born in Chicago on the 19th of April 1903. He studied criminology at the University of Chicago, trained as a marksman, and, although married, had no children. His occupation: Treasury agent and head of the special squad created to fight corruption. At just 28 years old, Eliot Ness worked in an inefficient and forgotten agency. Yet he was about to become the nightmare of the most powerful man in Chicago. On the stand, Ness did not merely point to Capone as a common bootlegger. He accused him of being the chief architect of the cancer eating away at the city. In a firm voice, he listed his accomplices: corrupt policemen, bribed judges, politicians on payroll. All were part of the network that allowed the boss to rule Chicago as his personal domain. Gambling, alcohol, prostitution, nothing moved without Capone's approval. A third of his empire's income went solely to bribes, along with favors and privileges distributed among his allies. Chicago was in his hands until one young agent chose to stand against him. Under his command, the men who would soon be known as the Untouchables began dismantling the brewery network that filled the mob boss's coffers, cutting off his main sources of income. Extortion, kidnappings, blackmail, every operation of Capone's was exposed. At first glance, Capone continued to present himself as a respectable businessman. His cabarets and speakeasies served as a facade for a criminal empire. But Ness refused to be deceived. To prove it, he recounted during the trial one of the bloodiest episodes in the mobster's career, a crime that would forever mark Chicago's history: the Street Valentine's Day Massacre. On the 14th of February 1929, Capone's men set up an ambush against the rival gang of George Bugs Moran. The war for control of bootlegging had reached its most brutal point. Whoever destroyed the other would own the city. Disguised as policemen, the killers stormed a warehouse where Moran's men were unloading illegal liquor. They disarmed them, lined them up against a wall, and within seconds executed them at point-blank range. 7 bodies lay sprawled on the ground. There was a single survivor who, before dying, barely managed to whisper to investigators. It was an accident. Omertà de love silence prevailed even in the face of death. Capone worked hard to erase any trace of his involvement. According to legend, he ordered the execution of the hitmen involved, beating them to death with a baseball bat. No one was to be able to link him to the slaughter. The press portrayed him as a ruthless boss, a man no one could challenge without paying in blood. He was never officially declared a public enemy by the president, but in 1930, the Chicago Crime Commission labeled him Public Enemy 1, while Herbert Hoover's White House pushed to bring him to justice. On the other side of that war, a young agent named Eliot Ness set out to be the man who would bring him down. Meanwhile, Capone's lawyers tried another approach, to present him as a mere scapegoat of a corrupt system. They claimed that the real culprits of the crisis were the Wall Street bankers and speculators. That same year, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange collapsed, dragging the country into the Great Depression. Hunger and unemployment spread across the United States, and Chicago was among the hardest-hit cities. Capone knew how to exploit the situation. Although the massacre had horrified public opinion, he sought to clean his image by funding soup kitchens and milk distributions for children initiatives amplified by friendly newspapers. During 1929 to 1930, he served a short sentence in Philadelphia for carrying a weapon. Upon returning to Chicago, his organization continued these charitable acts that polished his reputation. In court, however, Ness showed the other side. He admitted that at first he was naive, unable to grasp the scale of the corruption. Every time he planned a raid, someone tipped off the mobsters, who dismantled their stills and vanished without evidence. The cases never reached trial. That frustration became his driving force. At just 28 years old, Eliot Ness had a mission. To defeat Capone, it would not be enough to catch him in a speakeasy or charge him with minor offenses. He had to destroy the system that sustained him, the alcohol smuggling, and the network of bribes that shielded him. His plan was simple yet daring: to recruit incorruptible agents, men without a price, immune to fear and money, young, honest, and with no ties to the Mafia. The proposal convinced prosecutor George E. Q. Johnson, who granted him full authority. Ness would answer only to him. Thus began a meticulous search. Each candidate had to pass rigorous tests. Gamblers, womanizers, and anyone susceptible to drink or easy money were ruled out. This was the beginning of the group that the press would soon christen the Untouchables. From that strict selection emerged an exceptional team. Frank Basile, a director and expert in chases, who had worked as an informant and trusted aide. Martin Lahart, a former wrestler, ideal for hand-to-hand combat. Sam Seeger, a detective with great skill in surveillance. Joseph Leeson, a sharpshooter. Lyle Chapman, strategist and operations planner. And Paul Robsky, a specialist in telephone wiretaps. A small group designed to avoid leaks. Young, incorruptible men, willing to risk their lives against the empire of crime. They had no name yet, but soon the press would christen them with one that would go down in history: the Untouchables. Their first target was the speakeasies, the clandestine bars where hundreds of liters of alcohol flowed every night. The strategy was simple: strike at the heart of the business and expose it to public opinion. The first raid took place in one of Chicago's most famous establishments. They entered by surprise, searched the premises, and arrested everyone present. Everything seemed a success, until reality hit them in the face. Ness had made a mistake. There was no search warrant, and during the operation, the alcohol was destroyed. Without evidence, there could be no charges. The detainees, including public figures, were released just hours later. The young agent, who saw himself as a crusader for justice, had lost the first round, but Ness was not a man who gave up easily. He took the lesson calmly and returned to work, determined to perfect his methods. The war had only just begun. After that failure, he realized he had to strike at the very roots of smuggling. His new strategy was meticulous: trace the path of the barrels between bars and secret distilleries. Each night, when the clubs closed and the empty kegs were taken back to hiding, Ness drew red lines on a map, connecting each point until he reconstructed Capone's alcohol routes. In the early hours, around 2 a.m., a truck began its route. Ness's men followed it confidently, convinced that this time nothing could go wrong. He even invited journalists to witness his long-awaited triumph. But the result was humiliating. When they opened the barrels, they found not alcohol, but water. The kegs had been washed before being refilled. The operation that was supposed to be his great victory turned into public embarrassment. The press mocked him, and critics branded him an inexperienced rookie. Ness knew he had no margin left for a third mistake. Meanwhile, Capone kept growing stronger. On the 17th of March 1930, he was released from Philadelphia prison for good behavior, after serving a few months for carrying an illegal weapon. Back in Chicago, with the smuggling monopoly under his control, he couldn't believe that a young agent and his small team posed any real threat. To mock them and show his power, he even voluntarily surrendered to the Chicago police. Since there was no evidence against him, he was released immediately. In that duel with Ness, Capone was scoring points, while journalists remained fascinated by the spectacle of the clever godfather who defied the authorities. The press, in truth, had become one of the Mafia's greatest allies. The 10th of October 1931. The trial against Capone revealed the magnitude of his power. A key witness, photographer Herbert Kaplan, recounted how he had tried to capture a photo of the mob boss. As he prepared his camera for a close-up, Capone's men stopped him, searched him, and threw him out without hesitation. The message was clear. No one controlled Capone's image, but Capone himself. In the courtroom, his attitude was proud, arrogant, always with an answer for everything. His lawyers tried to present him as an exemplary citizen, but that facade crumbled before the jury. They saw him for what he really was, the embodiment of vice. A rich, extravagant man, owner of a hotel turned headquarters, a mansion in Florida, a smoker of Cuban cigars, and wearer of flashy suits. Capone projected luxury and power, but beneath that facade lay an empire of blood and corruption. At his peak, Al Capone not only ruled Chicago, he also inspired Hollywood. Films such as Scarface and Little Caesar drew directly from his legend, turning him into a symbol of power amid a nation struck by the Great Depression. For many, that Italian immigrant who had come from nothing embodied the American dream, even if through crime. But that image was a double-edged sword. His lawyers knew it and tried to soften it. In court, they portrayed him as a family man, a devoted son and exemplary husband, a benefactor whose only sin had been succeeding too much in a country where others had failed. They painted him as an honest Italian-American, a victim of envy and media persecution by men like Ness. The leader of the Untouchables didn't take long to strike back. For Ness, Capone was neither a hero nor a symbol, but a ruthless killer who deserved to end his days in prison. And he swore that he would be the one to bring down the godfather of Chicago. Meanwhile, Ness's headquarters intensified its efforts. It remained active day and night, calls multiplied, tips poured in from informants, and often false leads planted by Capone's men to mislead the agents. It was a war of attrition. Ness waited patiently for the moment to deliver a decisive blow. He knew that if Capone escaped again, his own credibility would collapse, along with the political backing that sustained his mission. Tension in the streets was rising. Clashes between the police and organized crime were becoming more frequent, and often bloodier. The 13th of June, 1930. A wiretap gave Ness the opportunity he had been waiting for. The agents tracked a truck loaded with barrels to a seemingly innocent laundry. This time, there would be no room for mistakes. They watched every movement with extreme care. The trucks leaving carried freshly washed barrels. Following that trail, they finally discovered the hideout they had been looking for. What they found inside changed the course of the war. An impressive stash of bottles and barrels full of illegal alcohol. Without hesitation, they destroyed the seized material. Tens of thousands of dollars literally went down the drain. Aware of the media impact, Ness called the press and presented several of Capone's lieutenants in handcuffs before the cameras. The image spread across the country. It was the first major real victory, not only legal, but symbolic on the battlefield where Capone had always felt comfortable: public opinion. The operation proved that this small group could strike at the heart of the underworld business. But every triumph brings consequences. Ness knew it. To challenge the most powerful crime boss in Chicago so openly meant putting his team's lives at risk. Capone reacted with fury. He ordered intimidation, offered bribes, and issued explicit threats. He wanted Ness eliminated. The message was clear, and terror materialized in violent arrests, ambushes, and murders. Harassment was constant, 24 hours a day. Capone always relied on two complementary tools: force to terrorize and corruption to negotiate. He first tried to buy the team off with ever-increasing sums. None accepted. Ness's response was immediate and public. He called the press and revealed the price Capone had put on his silence. The gesture solidified the group's image and accelerated its media baptism. That small, incorruptible team began to be known to everyone as the Untouchables. A story that fascinated the public. Paradoxically, what only days before had seemed a group destined to be dissolved now enjoyed popular support. The government, pressured by this wave of approval, provided them with a new ballistics department equipped with advanced technology to fight crime. But Capone was far from surrendering. He organized a counterattack and infiltrated spies into Ness's own operation. Now it was the Untouchables' headquarters that was being wiretapped. Ness held in his hands a list of corrupt police officers, a document capable of toppling the entire police hierarchy of Chicago. A tool as powerful as it was dangerous, one that made him a completely isolated man, and a prime target for the crime syndicate. The war in Chicago had reached a new level. Threats multiplied, and Ness became a constant target. He was followed, his calls were intercepted, and every aspect of his private life was scrutinized. His wife, Edna, lived for months under permanent protection. 2 bodyguards accompanied her day and night, turning her into a prisoner in her own home, never knowing if her husband would return alive at the end of the day. The pressure began to strain the couple's relationship, but Ness remained unshaken. To him, any sacrifice was worth it. He was convinced that his mission would elevate him to the rank of hero, and he was beginning to taste that future glory. The President of the United States himself had expressed his support. He needed Ness to restore the nation's image and rid Chicago of its shameful title as the capital of organized crime. The Windy City had become a diseased organism, consumed by corruption and poisoned by Neapolitan mafias that undermined the economy and spread death across every corner. The Mafia, however, also knew how to send a clear message. The 13th of March 1932. Frank Basile, former director and close collaborator of the Untouchables, disappeared without a trace. Hours later, his body was found mutilated, his skull crushed and his tongue torn out. The savagery was brutal. Basile had fallen into a carefully prepared trap, and his death became a direct warning to Ness. The next victim could be him. The murder of Frank Basile made it clear that the conflict with Capone had ceased to be a professional confrontation and had become a war to the death. Basile, a man with a troubled past but loved by his comrades, had been a pillar for Ness. His disappearance and the brutality of his execution deeply shook the team. Ness, who had trusted him despite his flaws, immediately understood that the threat now touched what was closest to him. The safety of his wife, Edna, became an absolute priority. She had to leave her home and live under round-the-clock protection. 6 guards watched over her residence. Her life was reduced to constant surveillance, stripped of normality. The personal pressure tested her relationship with Ness, but his resolve was ironclad. The crueler the Mafia's reprisals, the stronger his determination became. Within weeks, the group's actions began to bear fruit. Alcohol trafficking dropped significantly. Establishments closed, supply routes were disrupted, and with less money circulating, the bribery capacity of the criminal network weakened. Chicago began to feel the difference. The city that had once been a constant flow of illegal business was slowly turning into the dry city that Ness envisioned. To deliver a symbolic blow, Ness designed a media spectacle of immense impact. He gathered all the automobiles confiscated from the Mafia since the first raids and organized a nighttime parade through Chicago's avenues. He called the press and, in a move meant to humiliate the boss, phoned Capone, telling him to look out his window at 11 o'clock sharp. At the appointed time, a caravan of seized vehicles crossed the city, slowly passing in front of the crime syndicate's headquarters. The images spread across every newspaper. It was a display of civic power, a public challenge that demonstrated the state's ability to strike its enemy. For Ness, it was a resounding victory. For Capone, an intolerable insult. The Godfather's response was immediate and violent. "I want Ness," he roared, "and I want him dead." From then on, Ness lived under obsessive surveillance. He changed beds and routes, avoided routines, and moved everywhere with protection. The feeling of being watched became constant. Every shadow could hide an enemy. Capone, wounded in his pride, arrogantly denied that Ness and his team had any real evidence against him. He claimed the entire campaign was nothing more than a media show. But the real blow came not from guns or spectacular raids, but from pencils and paper. The key was the arrest of a trusted man, the organization's accountant. Once detained, the economic structure of the empire began to tremble. Among his belongings were accounting books that, at first glance, seemed insignificant. However, Ness and Treasury investigators, with the technical support of the IRS, knew how to read what had previously been invisible: the financial trail of an empire with no declared legal income. Those ledgers contained detailed expenses, invoices for luxury hotels, purchases of tailor-made suits, automobiles, and jewelry. They also recorded huge sums of cash that reappeared as bank checks. The name, Capone, appeared nowhere. But the financial trail was undeniable, an empire of wealth without a single legitimate income source. The evidence was as clear as daylight. The Godfather of Chicago could not justify his fortune. That previously invisible weakness became the Achilles' heel of the most feared man in America. Capone understood the danger. If he were prosecuted for tax evasion, his entire empire built on corruption and fear could crumble like a house of cards. Meanwhile, the Treasury team and IRS investigators tightened the noose around the so-called beer barons. Every financial move was monitored, every partner investigated, every bank account traced. The network that had once made Capone invincible was now beginning to strangle him from within. The mob boss, increasingly cornered, turned to desperation. In a last attempt to stop the process, he ordered the assassination of the prosecutor and the head of the Treasury. It was a reckless, almost suicidal move that showed just how much control he had lost. Everything unfolded at dizzying speed. Although the charge was only for tax evasion, Capone realized that this minor accusation had the power to destroy him completely. Abandoned by several of his former allies, he appeared at the hearings as a nervous, vulnerable man far removed from the image of the untouchable he had projected for years. The 12th of October 1931, the penultimate day of the trial. The courtroom was packed full of journalists, onlookers, and photographers vying to capture the mob boss's face under the flashlights. The most attentive observers noticed a disturbing detail: the discreet conversations among Capone's lawyers, the tense gestures, the conspiratorial air. It was evident they were preparing their last card, a move that could turn the trial around. The witness called was Richard Hart. He was 40 years old, had an impeccable record, and an aura of legend. He had been a sheriff in Nebraska and a bodyguard to President Calvin Coolidge, a man who never missed a shot from 12 meters away. But what defined him was not his aim, it was his moral reputation. Hart had worked for peace with native communities and lived by a single creed: the law is the law. For the defense, that testimony was pure gold. He embodied authority, integrity, and justice. His statement alone could tilt the balance and portray Capone as the victim of an excessive persecution. But there was a secret that could change everything. Richard Hart was not his real name. That man was actually Vincenzo Capone, Al's older brother, who had disappeared in adolescence fleeing family violence. The defense's last card was about to be revealed. To understand it, one had to go back in time. Vincenzo Capone, the eldest of the family, had left home at 16, tired of the violence surrounding his brothers. Years later, in 1924, he tried to return to Chicago to visit his mother. But his return coincided with the tragic death of another brother, Frank, gunned down by the police. That event sealed the rift once and for all. Al expelled Vincenzo from the city. Under the name Richard Hart, Vincenzo built a new life in Nebraska sheriff, presidential bodyguard, and defender of the law. When Capone's lawyers tried to present him as their star witness, he refused. He had not forgiven his brother's affront and would not save him. The defense, without its secret card, was left with no options. Ness was about to win the duel. Witnesses came forward one after another, and little by little, the silence broke. Tongues loosened, fear changed sides. The myth of Capone's invulnerability began to crumble. The trial was concluded. The verdict would be announced the next day. On the night of the 16th of October 1931, Capone lived his final hours as a free man. He warned his wife May of the inevitable and roamed the streets of Chicago one last time. Dark bars, dives, nightclubs, and brothels. To his mistresses, he swore that he would be acquitted the next day, though even he didn't seem convinced. Legend has it that that night, desperate, he looked up to the sky and implored the moon, "Tell me, who has betrayed me?" The answer came the next morning in the courtroom. Capone was sentenced to 11 years in prison for tax evasion, along with a $50,000 fine and payment of court costs. The courtroom erupted in murmurs and applause until the judge called for silence. In the corridors, the mob boss crossed paths with Eliot Ness one last time. With a half smile, he uttered a phrase meant to sound prophetic. "I've had bad luck, but, without me, your life is ruined." As he left the courthouse, he bought an apple from a street vendor and paid her generously, as if wanting to leave behind the image of the great gentleman he claimed to be. That same night, he entered the county jail, beginning the path that would end his reign. Convicted, Al Capone would finally serve his sentence. He was transferred in August 1932 to the federal prison in Atlanta, Georgia. The transfer was presented as a triumph of good over evil, and the press turned it into a national spectacle. At midnight, the prison gates opened before a crowd of photographers. Capone appeared upright, proud, head held high. He wanted to project pride, as if he were still the man who had ruled Chicago with an iron fist. He wore a white hat and a dark purple suit, an eye-catching outfit that would surely be out of fashion by the time he regained his freedom. He was hidden among other common prisoners, his image carefully shielded from the cameras. The convoys moved through the city under heavy guard to prevent any escape attempt. The radio broadcasted the transfer live, and thousands gathered along the route to catch one last glimpse of prisoner number 40886. The man who had gone from popular idol to public enemy number 1. Among those present, Eliot Ness appeared before the journalists. His smile, directed at the cameras, concealed a very different feeling. To him, 11 years in prison for tax evasion was an insufficient punishment. He would have preferred to see Capone sentenced to life imprisonment for the violent crimes he had ordered on the streets of Chicago. But history was changing. In 1933, Franklin D. Roosevelt began his first term as President of the United States and, on December 5 of that same year, repealed Prohibition. With a single decree, the context that had enabled Capone's rise disappeared forever. The empire of illegal alcohol had come to an end. For Eliot Ness, however, the repeal radically changed everything. What had fooled his crusade against crime for years vanished overnight. And suddenly, the famous Prohibition agent found himself with no bootleggers to chase, no enemies to defeat. During those same years, popular culture began to immortalize that battle. A Chicago newspaper published a comic strip that fascinated readers. The story of Detective Dick Tracy and his arch-enemy Big Boy, a mob boss clearly inspired by Al Capone. No one doubted who had served as the model for the hero and for the villain. The fame of Eliot Ness extended beyond official records. He became a public figure, admired and recognized throughout the country. Convinced of his renown, he even considered himself a legitimate candidate for the prestigious FBI. But his ambitions met an unexpected obstacle: his own superior, J. Edgar Hoover. The powerful bureau director saw in Ness an uncomfortable rival too prominent in the media and too famous to share the spotlight. He chose to block Ness's ambitions and allowed his applications to fade into oblivion. Ness never joined the FBI, and that setback marked the beginning of his personal decline. He took refuge in alcohol, left his wife, and accumulated failure after failure. The man who had led the fight against America's most feared gangster became an awkward myth, one few wanted to hear from. Even when he tried to write his memoirs, no journalist in Chicago offered him help. He died in 1957, shortly before his book was published, never knowing the success or the legendary status he would achieve later. Meanwhile, American justice was preparing to take a final step in its war against crime. In 1934, off the coast of San Francisco, a prison rose that was conceived to be inescapable: Alcatraz. Its inauguration was supervised by prosecutor George Johnson, the same man who had brought Capone to trial. The fortress was ready, and as a symbol of America's victory over its demons, one of the first to occupy its cells would be the very man who had made Chicago the capital of organized crime: Al Capone. On the 19th of August 1934, Capone entered Alcatraz. He was registered as prisoner number 85. The man who had ruled Chicago through violence and corruption still had 5 years left to serve. But he was no longer the invincible boss of old. His fortune had been confiscated by the federal government. His power was only a distant memory, and in prison, he was no longer respected. With restricted visits and stripped of the influence that had once protected him, he was attacked in the mess hall by other inmates. At Alcatraz, the real tough men were others. Leadership now belonged to George "Machine Gun" Kelly, a criminal who embodied the new hierarchy behind the prison walls. Capone, however, was ill. The syphilis that had plagued him since his youth was advancing unchecked. The man who had once held America in his hands now faced a future without promise and a past that was fading from his memory. In 1938, his wife May received special permission to visit him. She found him unrecognizable, obese, aged, and mentally diminished. Shortly after, the authorities decided to transfer him. Keeping him in Alcatraz was too risky. Sick, vulnerable, and surrounded by enemies, eager to earn the glory of being the one who killed Capone. Not long after leaving prison, Capone suffered episodes of partial amnesia and progressive mental decline. The syphilis that had followed him since youth had reached his nervous system. While the United States entered the war in 1941, he spent his days in a Miami mansion, isolated from everything, forgotten by almost everyone. On the 25th of January 1947, amid a typical Florida storm, Al Capone drew his last breath. The man who had made Chicago the capital of organized crime, the gangster who had defied the government and ruled a multi-million-dollar empire, died alone, sick, and without glory. His death barely occupied a few lines in the newspapers, buried behind baseball scores. Thus ended the life of a man who had once held all of America in his hands. The story of Al Capone and Eliot Ness reminds us that even the mightiest empires can fall, that behind violence, fear, and money, there is always a price to pay sooner or later. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the darkest and most fascinating chapters in the history of organized crime. If you found this documentary interesting, please subscribe, leave a like, and share it. Your support is essential to help us continue bringing to light more real stories about the mafia and crime. See you in the next episode.